Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Cooper Hewitt Design Center. My name is Sarah Freeman. I'm the Public Education Manager at Cooper Hewitt National Design Museum. The museum, as you may know, is closed until the autumn of 2014. So while we're under renovation, all of our educational activities for families, teens, adults, are happening up here at the Design Center. So we look forward to having you here again and to welcoming you back to the museum when we reopen in 2014. We're also extremely grateful to Target for making this center a reality. And we would like to thank them also for making these particular Harlem Focus community programs possible. The next Harlem Focus will be the last one for the summer. It will be on Wednesday, July 10th with landscape architect Elizabeth Kennedy. So for further information, check our website and we hope to see you there. Tonight's lecture with John Reddick and Marie Warsh from the Central Park Conservancy is going to be filmed and webcast live and will be available on our website, cooperhewitt.org. So be sure to check it out and you can see footage from past programs as well. John Reddick is active in architectural preservation and has written on Harlem's architectural and cultural history. He is a graduate of the Yale School of Architecture, and his love of architecture, African American culture, and history have been conveyed on numerous occasions through tours and articles he's provided for the Studio Museum in Harlem, El Museo del Barrio, the Whitney Museum, the Biography Channel, New York's Historic Districts Council, and many other institutions. Please join me in welcoming John Reddick.
Well, thank you. Thank you for turning out, and this looks like a threatening night. Good for the plants, so in Central Park. I'm really pleased tonight to have Marie Walsh with us. She's with the Central Park Conservancy. You've been there about how many years now? 8 years, oh wow. And the Conservancy has really taken a real focus and look at the not only just the design, but the infrastructure around what makes these designs work and have a life, a long life in terms of the public use. And as we were looking at Harlem, and the focus of this series has been really to look at Harlem professionals or aspects of Harlem design, and no better part of that Harlem design is Central Park. And for East Harlem residents and the residents of the southern end of Central Park, the Conservatory Gardens has been a great respite in terms of spending time in the park, but also for family events, weddings, and other activities. And so it was a great honor to have Marie here. So she went to Smith College, went to Bard Graduate Studies in Landscape Design, has become a real expert on 60s playground design, a real kind of focus, and really has some real great insights on that period of design around play equipment and activities for young people. But tonight she's here to talk about the Conservatory Gardens, so we'd like to welcome Marie Warsh.
Thank you, John, and thanks everyone for coming. As John mentioned, we're going to talk tonight about the Conservatory Garden and really use it as a way to talk about garden design, the art of color, variety, and form. The garden is one of, as John was mentioning, is a really important amenity in the northern part of Central Park. We did a user survey of the park a couple of years ago and found that the garden is the most visited part of the northern part of Central Park. So it's really a big amenity for neighborhood residents, but also from people all over the city and all over the world. And it's located right at 104th Street, between 106th Street and 103rd Street, just along Fifth Avenue here. And here's the Harlem Mirror, which is another kind of key landscape in the northern part of the park, the North Woods, which is this large area of woodlands, the Lasker Pool and Rink, which is right kind of across from us here. And so these are some of the key landscapes that surround the garden. And here's just another kind of contextual view of the garden in its context in the park. So here's the garden right here. The garden was built in 1937, and the beginning of this lecture is going to focus on the history of the garden. And really a lot of the garden's, its origins and history really have to a lot to do with the history of the northern part of the park, and so I'm going to focus on that a little bit as well. I'm also going to talk about the different areas of the garden. This is the central garden, which was designed in an Italian style. It's flanked by an alley of crabapple trees on either side, which is one of the kind of great draws in the spring when they're blooming. The northern part of the garden was designed in a French style and is really known for these seasonal displays of tulips in the spring and chrysanthemums in the fall. And then the southern part of the garden was designed in an English style and is known for its kind of perennial beds and annual plantings and really a kind of more naturalistic and somewhat wild appearance at times. And really, this garden is just a really ideal way to explore the art of garden design because it integrates these three different styles and because it really provides such a intense variety of plantings that really transform throughout the seasons and a real sort of diversity of plantings. This is an image of the three sections of the garden in spring. And so it really just already kind of shows us how diverse.
We're just mentioning to Marie earlier, I mean, this could be a Tiffany panel. You can really kind of see how in the sort of formalizing nature, you're also inspiring a look at it in a more structured way, but the color variety and the mix here is really an excellent example of the variety you can see in the park.
Yeah, and this is just in spring, and so all of these areas completely transform during each season. And I also want to talk about kind of how the garden is currently designed and maintained as well, and that this doesn't happen. It has a whole crew of people kind of working constantly on making it happen. So beginning with history, really again the history and origins of the conservatory garden are really related very much to the history of the northern part of the park and really northern Manhattan in general. And this really starts before the park is even constructed. This is an image from 1854 of Manhattan Island before the park is constructed, and this is the reservoir that was integrated into the final design of the park. So to give us a little sense of where we are, this is about 42nd Street. And as you can see, the city's kind of moving northward, but there's really not a lot of development in this northern part of the park. This is the High Bridge, which brought the Croton Aqueduct system, or part of the High Bridge Croton Aqueduct system that brought water to the central reservoir, which was here and also here. And so that's, the city's kind of building up this infrastructure, but there's really not, there's still a lot of farmland in the northern part of the park and some small industries and other settlements. And the construction of the park beginning in 1858 does spur development in the neighborhoods adjacent to the park, the southern part of the park. But really the northern part of Manhattan still remains relatively undeveloped until pretty much the late 19th century. And the northern part of the park is very different than the southern part of the park. This image shows the south with the pond here. This is the mall, the Ramble, the lake, these very kind of prominent, iconic features and landscapes in Central Park. And it's pretty intricately designed. There are a lot of architectural features. There's a lot of sculptures. And the northern part of the park doesn't really get as much of this type of treatment. This is in part because by the time they start building that end of the park, they've run out of money for a lot of these types of features. Originally, the plan for the park only went up to 106th Street, and in 1863, they decided to acquire the land between 106th Street and 110th Street. And that was in part because that land was kind of considered difficult to develop. It had a lot of natural features such as large rock outcrops. The whole landscape over that way that is now what we call the North Woods is really defined by these huge rock outcrops and hills. And this was something that it was going to be hard to develop for real estate purposes. And so that was one of the reasons it ended up becoming part of Central Park. So again, this rugged and more natural quality that existed in this northern part of the park was really integrated into the design of the park. And this is the Glen Span Arch, which is in part of the North Woods. And you can see some of the rocky character. And there were also a lot of, there was some forest that was preserved and integrated into the park. And this is some of the landscape actually right over here by the mount. This area of the park also integrated some existing man-made features, including fortifications that were originally built during the Revolutionary War and then rebuilt again during the War of 1812. And you can still see these on old maps of the park. This is a map from, I think, 1872, and you can still see the line of fortifications. And these are images from the early 19th century illustrating what some of the forts looked like at the time. And this was something that the builders and commissioners of the park thought could be an attraction. It would be something that people would come to in the northern part of the park, because again, it was hard to get people up there initially. Another existing feature that was important to the kind of idea of the northern part of the park was a convent called the Convent of Mount St. Vincent, which basically was kind of taken by eminent domain, and the nuns kind of moved to the Bronx, but this structure remained and became a restaurant for a long time, and then also a museum. And this is an image of the sculpture gallery in the museum. And so this was another kind of attraction that was intended to kind of get people to come up here.
Roughly, where was that in the park?
This was in the area what's called the Mount, so literally right above the Conservatory Garden. And you can still see part of its original foundation is still visible from the path that's on the northern part of the garden. And the area that would become the garden was actually originally intended as an arboretum of northeastern trees. And so again, this kind of fit in with this idea that the park, this area of the park had a bit of a didactic function, and this was another kind of way to get people to come up here.
And that's Fifth Avenue?
Yeah, this is Fifth Avenue, and this is the Greensward plan, which is the original plan for Central Park, and shows that this is the 106th Street border, so the original border. So the garden would be built here, and then the park ended here at this point in time. And what ended up happening to this area is that it became this kind of horticultural operations center. It was a place where they grew a lot of the plants that were then planted in the rest of the park. And this function was formalized in the 1880s. They actually built a greenhouse structure on this site. And then in 1899, they built this conservatory, which still had this operational function. It grew plants that were actually then used not only in Central Park, but in parks throughout Manhattan. And it also had this public component. It had displays of actually chrysanthemums and also these kind of spring flowers, and the public would come and see them. And it was a big attraction that was written about a lot in the newspaper every year. And these are some images from that, showing the sort of Victorian bedding displays. I think these are the chrysanthemums. So this was a big attraction, and this is the reason that the Conservatory Garden was called the Conservatory Garden, was after this conservatory. And in 1934, Robert Moses becomes Parks Commissioner, and he embarks on this ambitious overhaul of Central Park, but also really the entire park system, building numerous new parks, playgrounds, swimming pools. And in Central Park, the plans for the Conservatory Garden is part of a larger plan to, again, modernize and overhaul Central Park and add a number of new facilities. And one of the most motivations for building a formal garden in Central Park is this idea that Moses talked about wanting to plant flowers in a sort of small, concentrated area as opposed to spreading them out throughout the park systems, and that this in part would be easier to maintain and also become an attraction. And he wanted to create formal gardens similar to this in the rest of the 5 boroughs. So this was a larger initiative. I think this was the only garden of this type that was built at the time. He was also wanted to tear down the conservatories, in part because he thought they were too expensive to maintain, and they were becoming deteriorated. So that was sort of the motivations for creating this garden. So construction begins in 1937. This is an image of the construction of the central part of the garden. And this is the southern part of the garden under construction. And this, and then here's the sort of completed garden in 1937. It opens in September of 1937. And this was a project that was constructed with funds from the Works Progress Administration. And again, this was one of many projects going on in Central Park at this time, and many of these were constructed with the same funding. Some of these projects included a lot of new construction in this part of Central Park. This is the construction of the East 110th Street playground, the playground that's right literally across the street. This was one of 18 playgrounds that was constructed in Central Park between 1935 and 1936.
That's the wall of the Central
Yeah.
Park in the back, that low wall?
That's actually that right here is where we are. We're right here. So this is the entrance that's right over here. And this is the playground after it was open to the public. And there was actually a boathouse already here that was built in around 1913. But what the construction of this playground, and there was the playground at 108th Street was built around the same time. Really what it does is kind of urbanize this area of the park, which had really, until this time, been much more kind of rustic and undeveloped. As part of this work, a lot of paths were added. And this really reflects the growth in population of the neighborhood surrounding this area of the park and sort of just the overall development of this part of Manhattan Island. In 1945 was another kind of large project around the Harlem Meer, which included the construction of this boathouse here to replace the other boathouse that was built in 1913. And again, a kind of grander boathouse that accommodated more boaters. And as part of this work, paths were added. There was never actually a path along this side of the Mere until 1945, just to show sort of how undeveloped this part of the park was. And for some reason, they fenced off this path along the shoreline here. Perhaps for safety reasons, it's kind of unclear. But a lot of the Moses era projects in the park, I think fences are kind of one way to kind of characterize a lot of what they were about. And even though the conservatory garden was a kind of different, a space that was very different than, let's say, a playground or a boathouse, similarly, it sort of had a fence around it and had a very particular function that was very different than the rest of the surrounding park. And the conservatory garden was a big attraction from the time it opened. There were numerous articles in the New York Times and other newspapers talking about how beautiful it was and how there were so many visitors, and it was really getting people up to this area of the park that was not as well visited. And this is an image of another chrysanthemums are a big theme here. So this is a chrysanthemum display in the fall. And the pergola, which was built in the central part of the garden, was sort of its main architectural feature. And it included in the bluestone paving along this part of it these references to the sort of commemoration of the 13 colonies, the 13 original states. And this was a reference to this Revolutionary War history, that the fortifications that existed pretty much adjacent to the garden. And to me, it seems also a way to kind of bring an American element to a garden design that was very European influenced. And so this was a way to kind of have an American reference within this design. And here's just a close-up something I took recently, just showing these kind of medallions with the 13 states. Another important sort of more architectural feature of the garden are what are called the Vanderbilt gates. So this is the main entrance to the garden. And these gates were installed as part of the garden when it was built in 1937, but they were originally located at what was known as the Vanderbilt Mansion on 5th Avenue and 58th Street. And this mansion was torn down in 1927, and the gates were salvaged and then donated to the city by Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney. And I'm not particularly clear on how they made their way to the Conservatory Garden, but
Bergdorf's is now.
yeah,
Bergdorf.
exactly. This is right at the southern end of Grand Army Plaza, where Bergdorf's is now. So the gardens were designed by Gilmore, who's seen on the left here, who is a landscape architect and a civil engineer, and the consulting landscape architect for the Parks Department. And so he's really responsible for a lot of the park development, design and development that's going on during this time. The plantings for the garden were designed by a woman named Betty Sprout, aptly named, who was married to Gilmore Clark, which is why she's called M. Betty Clark in her obituary. And I really, tried doing some research about her, and there's not a lot that I could find, except she did work in his office. He worked with another landscape architect called Michael Rapuano, and they had this office that, again, they were kind of the preeminent landscape architects of this time.
And one of the things that Moses is really doing, I mean, these people are designing homes for the wealthy. You talk about the Vanderbilt Gates, but they're designing homes for them in Long Island and all of that. And he's bringing now this expertise to bear in the public realm. So the quality that you're seeing and the interpretations that they're bringing are really from the wealthiest class of America really to these public forums.
Yeah, and I think you see that a lot when you start kind of analyzing some of his other designs as well. This is a design for Bryant Park, and it's really this kind of Beaux-Arts style that, was being used in these country estates and in the homes of, for the gardens of these wealthier people, and then being brought into this public landscape. He's also known for the design of the 1939 World's Fair, and you can also see here just in this plan view, the sort of axial, symmetrical design that sort of forms the structure of this space. And this was another project that Betty Sprout worked on, for which she apparently planted 1 million tulips. So these are the few things that I know about her. And again, I know I've been using this image a lot, but I think it really helps us see, again, the design of this garden, and particularly how it contrasts with the design of the park, which surrounds it. So you have the park with its sort of undulating pathways, these clumps of trees, this very naturalistic design that, again, was very as artificial in a lot of ways as the garden, but was intended to look natural. And what the garden kind of becomes in a way is this transition between the city and the sort of geometries of the city and the park. And I think you can see that well in this image here. And just kind of getting again at this sense of a formal garden design being put into Central Park, I wanted to show this image of, this is Bancroft Bay in one of the sort of bays that's off the lake in the center of the park, and to really kind of just reiterate the purpose of the park being this rural retreat and this kind of more this experience of nature in a very different way than a formal garden offered, but also that in the 1930s the park really starts to change and respond a little more to kind of urban life, and this is one of the last moments where there were still sheep on the landscape known as the sheep meadow, and you can see the kind of city kind of building up around it.
It's such a Gatsby skyline against the sheep. It's funny.
So the park, beginning in the early 20th century, but a lot during this period when the Conservatory Garden is built, really starts to transform. So the park, really beginning in the mid to late 1950s, a lot of the projects built by Moses and his administration really start to fall into decline. Originally, they were built with this public money. They had a lot of funds for maintenance in the beginning, and this funding is not sustained over time. There was originally 14 gardeners when working in the conservatory garden when it was first opened. And by the 1960s, there were 5 gardeners who were working occasionally in the garden and had responsibilities in other gardens throughout the city. So that really leads to a severe decline of the garden and really the entire park system. And Central Park is, particularly hard hit, being such a large park and a historic park.
And this is a peak period. I mean, you can see from the plantings that this is summertime and there's no water in the fountain. And
but there's still people in the garden, so that's a good sign. And so this is just another kind of image of some of that deterioration that begins. There's graffiti all over the park. Again, this is not limited to the conservatory garden. And what starts to happen throughout the park and also in the garden is that there are these volunteers who begin working in the park, and this is kind of a small, kind of, grassroots kind of effort to clean up the park. And this is volunteers from the Garden Club of America who start working in the conservatory garden and doing planting and pruning and sort of general maintenance projects to try to kind of revitalize the garden. And really these volunteer activities and concern about the state of the park really kind of come together, and city officials and philanthropists start becoming concerned, and that's what leads to the formation of the Central Park Conservancy in 1980. And this is an image of the management and restoration plan for the park, this book that was created in 1985 that really laid out a comprehensive restoration for Central Park. And even before this book came out, one of the first efforts of the Conservancy was actually to restore the conservatory garden. This started in 1982. The head of the Conservancy and also Central Park Administrator, Betsy Rogers, asked a woman named Lyndon Miller, who was a painter and a gardener, to design new plantings for the garden and a sort of general restoration plan. And this begins, I think, in 1983. And so this is just an image of that process beginning.
And even now, I mean, the Conservancy, you really do look at this history. The very history that we're talking about here is part and parcel of what's framing the decision-making for plant material.
Yeah, and a lot of the things in this book are still kind of considered. This really set up an approach for restoring the park that still very much informs the work that the Conservancy does. And so the lawn was resodded and all the hedges pruned, and lots of new plantings were added. And this is an image of the sort of reopening of the garden in 1987 with some of the sort of key people involved. This is Betsy Rogers. This is Henry Stern, who is the Parks Commissioner. I'm not sure who this woman is. And this is Lyndon Miller, who was the designer and is still involved in the design of and maintenance of the current conservatory garden. And again, just this idea of, through this horticultural restoration, really trying to revitalize this garden, which had fallen into serious decline, and again, also repairing things like the fountain and the benches and the paving and sort of the general infrastructure of this place. And really, there does start to be, visitors start coming back. But the garden is really this kind of little island in the midst of the northern part of the park, which is one of the most severely deteriorated parts of Central Park at this time and remains this way. There's kind of a focus on restoring the southern part of the park, and there's a sense that the northern part of the park is being a little bit neglected. And this is the way it looks. This is in the early 1980s. The boathouse that was built in 1945 had burned down. You could see the shorelines totally kind of eroding. And again, this fence, which, really creates this distance from the landscape. And then just another image of just how many fences, for some reason, were built in this area. It's kind of astonishing. And this area becomes completely transformed beginning in late 1980s. The Dana Center across the street from here is built. The fences are all removed from the shoreline, and plantings are added, and there's this real kind of natural planting edge that really allows access to the waterfront and a very different experience of this landscape. And fishing is one of the kind of ways now people experience this landscape.
You get a lot of waterfowl and other.
Yeah, there's a lot of kind of, a great increase in sort of natural beauty. So now I'm just going to go into the different areas of the garden in a little more detail. This is the central part of the garden, which is designed in this Italian style, and it's sometimes called a green garden because there's not a lot of flowering plants. These hedges here are spirea, which does bloom with white flowers in the spring. The pergola is covered in wisteria, which blooms in the summer with purple flowers, and then here are the apple trees, which again bloom in the spring. But otherwise, it's this kind of intense green garden, and green is actually not really just one color, but so many colors, and you can kind of see that in this space. And really, the vocal point of the space in a lot of ways is the fountain, which is a very kind of simple design, but really also has these great kind of ways it picks up on the light and sort of creates these rainbows and a cool spray in the summer. So this is kind of the prominent feature when you walk in. And then the pergola, which stands behind it. Here are the steps leading up to the pergola. And the pergola is a great work of kind of almost living architecture. It really transforms throughout the seasons. This is in the spring with the spirea blooming and sort of little going on. So on the pergola with the wisteria, you see more of the structure of the actual pergola. And then this starts to change in the summer with the wisteria blooming and growing. And then in the fall, it completely transforms. And, in this image, too, becomes very kind of melded with the backdrop of the park behind it. And the pergola is also a great place to sort of see some of the kind of what makes this design Italian in a lot of ways. You have the kind of openness when you walk in, and then you go up the stairs to the pergola, and you can have this kind of sense of enclosure, but also a sense of prospect, a way to kind of look out onto the garden from a higher elevation. And this is an image of the Villa d'Este in outside of Rome in Tivoli, and I thought this was a good kind of way to also think a little bit about what makes the conservatory garden Italian, and just sort of the key elements of water, sort of always an important element in an Italian garden, and also this sense of prospect and a sort of axial view. And this is a garden I just came across while doing this research, which I thought also was this really great kind of distillation of an Italian garden. This is the Italian water garden at Longwood Gardens. And so, again, this idea that, the conservatory garden and this garden, it's not trying to sort of recreate a particular Italian garden, but just sort of take the essence of what an Italian garden is.
This a little bit reminds you of the transition in the conservatory garden, as you see like the more rough nature environment beyond the sort of formal space.
Yeah, that definitely here too. You sort of get a sense of the landscape beyond, which is another feature of Italian gardens, as they were kind of often designed on hillsides with the sense of the landscape beyond, and the sort of different types of nature that the garden compared to the sort of wild nature represents. And so another, prominent feature of this central area, of course, are these apple tree, the crabapple allées. And these also have a great seasonal element to them. This is while they're blooming. And they really also, kind of similar to the pergola, form this great enclosed space. And so if the pergola is architecture becoming nature, this is sort of nature becoming architecture. And this is what it looks like when the petals fall to the ground.
It's almost like a pointillist painting. I mean,
Yeah.
Really you kind of understand the dots making a concentration of the pink or the white.
Yeah, and so just having the juxtaposition of these two colors kind of coming together in the middle. And then in the summer, still, again, it's being able to see how the branches of the trees really create this sense of structure. And they do so in a way that reminds me a lot of the mall, another kind of quintessential Central Park landscape, the sense of enclosure and canopy.
Well, you're talking about like nature inspiring architecture, and then architecture, the order that came out of that, coming back to nature. Because in nature, these trees would have never been lined up like that.
Right.
But some architect must have looked at that design and realized they could start building arches and things in cathedrals, and then that architecture comes back and informs the physical environment.
Well, yeah, and this idea of landscape architecture and landscape design kind of making that happen. And then the winter, too, just having a different experience of the same space. So the French side, the northern side, consists of these concentric circles, these concentric borders, this middle border with these parterres, and then this outer border, which is where the seasonal displays of chrysanthemums and tulips happen, and then this outer row here with hedges and also plantings of roses. And then there's sort of lilacs over on this side and over here. And so this, again, this is a different concept of seasonal change and transformation, whereas in the apple tree LAs, we have these plants that you see transform over time. Here we have different plants for different seasons. So this is the chrysanthemum planting, which again happens in the fall. And these are really kind of the vocal point in a lot of ways of this space. And just as we kind of move into the space, you kind of start to see how they become really prominent and very intense in a lot of ways. And there's really kind of an unexpected almost contrast of colors. There's a lot of pastel colors and kind of bright pinks and yellows, and it's something that you don't see in a lot of other plants as far as I've been able to discover. And here they are. This is an image of them currently, so we're going to have to wait a while.
Well, it's very interesting, though. If you go to the garden a lot over the summer, all this stuff starts to fill in. It's just amazing. You go back in 2 weeks.
Yeah, it's
3
very
weeks,
quick.
it's really dense. And then they prune it back to get it up to a certain height. They prune it back to get more blooms for the
Right.
next.
So the tulips in the spring, again, it's this sort of very kind of intense display of really color, but also a lot, they're planted often in these kind of geometric arrangements, and so you have also this display of form and shapes as well. And so again, looking at them from kind of far away, you have a sense of their shape and form, and that really changes when you get closer to them, and it's sort of more this experience of color. And I was thinking I could have a slideshow that would just be all of the displays of the tulips in the conservatory garden for the past 10 years, and that would probably be enough.
Now, have you seen Linda's paintings? I'm always curious. Linda Miller started out as a painter, and I'm always curious to see her art and wonder how close.
Yeah, I
she
have never seen it, actually.
It's interesting.
Yeah. And the center parterres are sort of what makes this maybe a quintessentially, or there's the quintessential French garden design element. These are made of a plant called germander, and they're in this spiral kind of shape, and they're planted with plants often inside it. They're not shown here, and also around it, so they become a container.
Sorry.
No, it's
But
okay.
the chrysanthemums right now,
Here.
they haven't bloomed yet, so this is what this will look like sort of around August, late July or August. So you see the greenery's filling in before it blooms, yet they make a great deal of the display around those entrances into the other areas. So you never feel like it's lacking in display.
Although when I was, I got a tour of the space with, oh wait, I'm looking for this one, with the woman who's the curator of this space, and they actually hadn't planted the chrysanthemums yet, and she said people were coming up to her and complaining that there was nothing in this space yet, and so people being impatient for for things to be filled in. So again, this is sort of the quintessential French element in this garden. The parterre, which means in French on the ground. Sometimes it's called parterre de broderie because it's a reference to embroidery and carpets and the patterns that were created by those, and sort of transferring that into the garden onto the ground. And so these are just two views of that in its more elaborate and extreme form in two French gardens. And I'm also interested in the way that these parterres are kind of used as containers as well. This is the kitchen garden at Villandry, and so this idea of the parterre used to contain these plantings of vegetables as well. And just a little bit about the fountain that is in the center of this part of the garden. It was not something that the garden was designed around. It was actually added a little bit later. This is a statue which is called The Dancing Maidens by Walter Schott, who is a German sculptor. And this was acquired by a man named Samuel Untermeyer, who was a lawyer and a civic leader, and I guess a self-made millionaire who had a estate up in Yonkers. And this was part of his estate there. And it was donated to the city and then integrated into this garden later.
So like Dolly Levi down from Yonkers.
Yeah.
3 girls from Yonkers.
So this, the southern part of the garden, I think I could safely say is a lot of people's favorite part of the garden. And in putting together this lecture, I actually had a hard time kind of figuring out how to talk about it because it's a space in which there's so much going on all the time. There's so much variety, there's so much different types of plant materials that it was hard to kind of come up with a concise way of describing it. But it's consisted of these planting beds which have hedges in the middle and typically have, some have annual plantings and others have perennial plantings. There's also a number of magnolia trees and other spring blooming flowering trees. There's a large crab apple in the center. There's also lilacs along the edges. And so in spring especially, this is a pretty amazing place. And I was thinking about this space and thinking about how it changed over time. And this is a photograph I took in late May when I visited the garden when I was first thinking about this lecture. And then this is the same spot a couple weeks ago, so just a month later. So really just in a month, feeling like you're almost in a completely different place. Here you have the alliums blooming, these just kind of coming up. Here's the hydrangea bush, and then here's the hydrangeas in bloom, and the alliums are kind of going to seed. And so just really in the course of a month, it being completely transformed. And so I wanted to kind of just go through some images of this garden in the different seasons and talk about how it changes. This is one of the magnolia trees with the bulb planting. There's typically large areas of daffodils and grape hyacinth and then tulips. And this is also when you can still see the structure of the garden. You get a better sense of the hedges, of the edges of the beds. And this is what starts to change a lot over the course of the season. And then just some close-ups of some of the plantings. Again, this is a great place to look at color in the garden. And on the outer slopes along the garden also have what's called the woodland slope, which is another really kind of beautiful spot and very different in a lot of ways, especially during the spring, than the planted areas. And so it's sort of a more naturalistic planting style. And then in the summer, it completely transforms. It becomes much more kind of wild, and sort of the plants start to escape their boundaries, their planting beds, and spill out into the pathways. here's just another image of that sort of happening. And so you have the annual plantings on one side and then sort of bordered by these perennial plantings. And again, this was sort of designed in the English style and sort of, which, you know, was first in the 18th century when landscape gardeners in England were starting to kind of come up with a new gardening style. It was really a reaction to the kind of rigidity and geometries of French gardening, which had been sort of the main vogue for a long time. And so it was this desire to kind of create a more naturalistic gardening style. And really in the early 20th century, this starts to become the sort of cottage garden and the perennial beds start to become the focus of a lot of gardeners in England. And this is an image of Sissinghurst, one of the famous gardens from the early 20th century. And then this is the red border at Hidcote, which is a sort of another famous kind of perennial border. And so these are some of the styles that the garden at the Conservatory Garden is integrating. And I think this part of the garden is a really great place to start thinking about combinations of plants. And I had a garden for a brief moment in time, and I would sort of come out. I worked across the street, and so I would come on my lunch hour and start thinking about combinations of plants and what looked good together, and sort of thinking about not just flowers, but also foliage and sort of texture. And so I think in a way this is a really great, especially this part of the garden is this really great kind of educational gardening. You can go and a lot of these annuals especially are plants that are easily identifiable and things that you can find. Maybe not the exact cultivar, but some version of it. And so I think this is a great, this is one of the great offerings of this space as well. Oops. And this garden also has a fountain and a sculpture. This was actually designed as part of the garden when the garden was designed differently than the Dancing Maidens, which were added, and also the Vanderbilt Gates, which were added. And this is a sculpture depicting, and a fountain depicting two characters from Frances Hodgson's Burnett's book, The Secret Garden. And so it's this idea that this space itself, and really the entire garden is this secret garden. And there's water kind of cascading down here, and this becomes kind of like a bird bath. And then it's placed in this little pool in which there are these amazing water lilies. And this is another great, again, this part of the garden really offering just such a huge variety of plants and horticulture. And this is another offering of that.
Even the bird bath, I mean, there's sculpted birds there, but then you see real birds landing there as well.
This is right in the center of the southern part of the garden.
So if you go into the main gate and go down the steps and you make a left, if you're looking at the formal garden dead on, you make a left and it's the secret garden, and you make a right and it's the French garden.
And then we have the transition from summer into fall when things start drying up and producing seeds. And that, the fall is a very exciting time in this garden. And a lot of the plantings were chosen to really to have a great effect in the fall as well. So this is not just spring and summer. We're really extending the interest in this space. And then in the winter, even though there's really not a lot going on, it's a really great time to see the structure of the garden and see the structure of some of these plants. And obviously when it snows, there's a lot of great transformation. And a lot of the hedges are evergreen, and so that also gives you a sense of the structure. And so again, this doesn't just happen by itself. There's a pretty large group of people who takes care of this garden. This is an image of Diane Schaub, who is the curator of the garden, and she's leading a tour of the garden. And so she's the curator. There's also an assistant curator. There are 3 gardeners, there's a ground technician, and there are 20 volunteers who work in the garden, not all at the same time, but at different times throughout the year, and sometimes more focused on special projects. So this is probably, I was trying to figure this out for certain, but I think this is the most intensely maintained part of Central Park. Oops. And this is just some, kind of just going into a little bit of the design process and how work it goes on in this space. This is an image of a drawing of the perennial beds, one of the perennial beds in the southern part. So with notations as to things being moved around and transplanted and divided. And so even though there's perennials, which are there every year, a lot of work goes into making sure that they look great every year.
Each of those circles are a different plant type.
Yeah. And again, most of these are there every year, but there's work that goes into keeping them, to maintaining them. And then this is an image of the annual planting bed, which is different every year. And this is something that the curator and the assistant curator design the plantings and choose the plantings for this bed. And as John was saying, every little blob is a different plant, and then this is sort of what it looks like as it starts to grow. And so then these are planted by the gardeners, and this is what they start to look like in the beginning. This is the annual plantings, what they start to look like in the beginning.
So yeah, so think back on that drawing. So that big shape that we saw in that drawing are those hedges down the middle. And then all that, even here you can imagine how many different plant types are making those different colors and shapes.
And I feel like every time I visit the garden, you see people trimming hedges. There's quite a lot of hedges in the garden, and as they really form the structure of the garden, it's a kind of a key piece of maintenance, is really to keep them trimmed and orderly. And this is sort of an example of a hedge that was recently trimmed and one that wasn't, the parterre. And so you see the sort of difference in effect and the sort of need for this type of really heavy maintenance. And there's, regular volunteers who are helping with planting and also doing pruning. I think we have at least one in the audience. And then just other kind of general kind of keeping things tidy.
I just remember Diane coming back, and there was one woman who clipped a hedge down way too low.
Oh, no.
And she almost fainted when she saw it.
Yeah, the sort of precision involved in a lot of these tasks is very important. So just a general sense of all the work that goes on to keep this place looking as great as it does. And in addition to general maintenance, there's often, or not often, but every so often, there are these even larger projects that are necessary to update the infrastructure of the garden. This is a project to install a new irrigation system that happened a few years ago. And in about 2010, the yew hedge in the central part of the garden was taken out. I think it was about 60 years old, and it was starting to decline, and its root systems were removed, and new soil was brought in, and then new hedges were planted. And originally, this is how they looked. They were individual plants, and then over time, they've kind of grown together. And well, as I was putting this together, John and I were talking. Both of us used to work together for the Conservancy in a building that's literally across the street from the garden. And for a period of time, this was actually the view from my window. And not that I was a very important person at the Conservancy. It just happened that I lucked out and got this view. And I used to kind of joke to people that I was actually the CEO, because this was,
I would pull the curtain if someone from the Parks Department or something came to visit. I wouldn't let them realize it was you were elevated view. And if you think of Versailles, and the whole Versailles is designed for that one window of the king, that in the way you kind of felt that way looking out at where El Museo de Barrio, that's the building we were in, and we could look out that window, and you really did feel like it was a very special. You start to understanding the empowerment that the great design and landscaping give, and particularly in nature. I think even more than a building, the sense that you sort of worked nature, you sort of got in there and sort of cut it down, got rid of the wildness and brought this order, and that this order changes and yet it still has this order. It's pretty magnificent.
Yeah, and it was pretty amazing to have this out my window, and often very distracting, and sort of took a lot of photographs, and really came to, as a result, appreciate the garden, and also understand that it wasn't about just this. It's not an object, it's not a view, it's really a place to experience, and really, it's great to see kind of how many different ways people enjoy it and use it, and I think even though in its design it does kind of in some ways conflict with the design of the rest of the park and the intent of this idea of these winding pathways and this experience of a landscape, really the way it's used and appreciated is very much related to the purpose of the park as this escape from the city and this enjoyment of essentially nature and landscape. And
Mount Sinai is not far away, and there's a nursing home, and you really do see people come out and really use it as, even when they're sort of afflicted in certain ways, they still, their attendants and stuff bring them to the park, and it's kind of peaceful environment.
But I think another reason that it is so successful is also because it's located in the northern part of the park. I think if this garden was located, in the East 70s, it would be completely crowded all the time. It would be harder to maintain it. And I think part of the reason this is so special is because it is, in some ways, a secret garden. It's a place that people don't even know about. And you can go in during your lunch hour and really not see very many people and really kind of escape from what you're doing, these are people I didn't take this picture, but this group of women I would see every time I went into this part of the garden during my lunch hour. And it's a place that you do see a lot of artists coming to paint and draw and photograph. And she's not supposed to be inside the parterre, but I couldn't resist showing this photograph.
But she's color coordinated.
Yeah, she's very color coordinated. And you do see a lot of school groups, a lot of children coming in and using it as a way to study gardens and to study horticulture, and that's also a nice aspect of it. So I just wanted to conclude here and say thank you very much for coming, and I think we're going to do some questions.
Well, thank you. Now, one of the things we mentioned, if you read this online, is that the Conservancy has a series of tours where you can actually tour the physical park. So we need to pass, when the end of the evening comes, if you give us your email address or a phone contact, we'll give you the 2 dates. I think it's this coming Saturday and a Saturday in July, but I don't want to give you the wrong date. So if you're interested in the tour, give us that information and we'll get back to you. Questions?
One of the slides you had up about the garden talked about initially there was a storyteller's corner in the garden. Well, anyway, I read part of it, and do you know what that corner might have been?
That was actually with the secret garden statue. I think that's what ended up being the storyteller's. I don't think it was a corner, but it was in that center part of the garden with the statue of the characters from the secret garden. Ended up being that.
And it's sort of like an amphitheater, the way the benches are organized. You can easily see a teacher sitting there and be able to talk to.
And that's how it was designed for that purpose, as a little gathering space for stories. I don't know if they actually ever did it, but yeah, it was intended as that.
More question. The lawn in the Italian garden, it just seems so big and so much space, and it's just lawn. And I don't know, I just wonder if, I know obviously it's trying to achieve that long look, but was there another reason why it's such a huge expanse of grass? Any other practical reason why?
I mean, I think it kind of gives a great sense of openness when you first kind of descend down the stairs. You just have this very open space, and it almost kind of gets you in a mindset of experiencing the garden. You kind of start to rest your eyes on the openness, and then you move into the other parts where you have much more an intricate design. I mean, I don't know.
And you also get the length. If you look at the plan, if that was foreshortened, it would have foreshortened all the layout of the other two gardens on the other side. That alley would have been reduced and all that. So I think you do need that distance to get the perspective and the sense of the fountain. And in the summer, it really is this lush greenery. It feels much cooler.
Yeah.
That whole transition, once you start under those trees and move back to that section of the park, it's 10 degrees different in temperature just for the shading and the proximity. If we think about the trees along the mall and look at these trees, even though they're branching, these are much lower and they're really arcing, really just above your headline as compared to being way up there. So you really do feel this kind of coolness there. And I think that the lawn kind of helps, buffer that. Anyone else? I thought I saw somebody else's hand.
Someone else asked about the location of the secret garden. Could you point that out up here?
Sure. It's hard to see
Start from the
because.
gate and then
Oh yeah, so here's the main entrance, and you come down the stairs, and this is the French side, and this is the English side,
Okay.
the south side. And so right here, actually, this is a big old, another crabapple tree. It's right under there.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
And one thing, if you walk along the street, because you do see that big lawn, everyone thinks about the lawn, but you really can't see these other gardens from Fifth Avenue. So you really
Right.
have to come in to the park, and there's a drop off from the street to these two garden beds. So I can see where some people, if you've passed it, you saw the gates, and the other part is there. But the really special sides are this in north and south, that space. Question?
This is kind of a housekeeping question. Who keeps up with all the labels? Because, for instance, in the springtime, all the daffodils are beautifully labeled.
The gardeners and the curators just do that, I think, as they're planting. But that's another great way that you can go in and learn more about the things that are planted in there, is that at least the bulbs are all labeled.
And that drawing that she was showing you earlier, where they circle and do that, I mean, they already know they're going to plant, and they can start in the winter. They do a lot of things there that they're doing when people don't really see it. So even developing those labels and the whole system of what they're going to do, they're doing all that prep in the downtime. So
It's really nice to see a plant and be able to have it in any place.
and to go early, I really encourage you, if you haven't been, to try to go like over the summer 2 or 3 times over the season. You'll just be totally shocked about the structure of the plants, how they change, or what you wouldn't expect to bloom that blooms, and all that. It's a kind of an education, but a joyous education.
Is there a greenhouse?
There's not a greenhouse. There's no longer a greenhouse in Central Park.
So where are the plants kept before they're brought? Or is it just
Well, I think they're ordered from nurseries and transported here.
directly? No.
Yeah, there's nothing that's being grown in the park. We do have an area of the park that's called the plant compound, which is where plants that are being planted in different parts of the park are just stored until we're ready to plant them, but we don't create or produce any of the plants ourselves.
And she has a couple back brings indoors, because the winter would kill them and put them back out, but there's very few.
With all these plants that are brought in and taken out, is there an opportunity for the public to basically use plants that
There is.
are
Yeah, they actually
They have what they call a bulb toss after the bloom of the tulips and all the bulbs. They have a thing called a bulb toss, and usually it's nonprofit groups or groups that want to use it for a community garden or other places. You come, there's a date. I don't know if they put it online, but they advertise it.
They do.
And you can come and get bulbs and things and collect them. And the same when the mum toss.
Yeah, I love the
when
mum
they
toss.
do the mums at the end of the season as well. And they're very hardy. You cut them back, and for them, they really have a different design each year. And sometimes stuff gets diseased. I mean, one time in the mum section, there was something wrong with the soil, and you'll see that one side is not as tall or as bushy as the other side. Even because the sun's different, that circle, even when they're hardy, there's one side that gets more sun that are much more intense than the side that doesn't get sun.
I have been to the garden when the chrysanthemum display is there in the fall, and It is one of the most amazing, beautiful, colorful experiences I've ever had, and if you haven't seen it, don't miss it.
And also, even Woody Allen appreciated it. We had an image, we didn't put it in.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I
But,
forgot.
but it's called Broadway Danny Rose, and there's a scene where Diane Weiss is talking to her boyfriend or whatever in the park. And even though I knew Central Park and I've been to the garden, the display was so unbelievable that I thought, oh, he just staged that for the movie. But it really was the planting. It was just unbelievable. How many people have been to the garden before? That's pretty good, about half. Any of you volunteer? We encourage you. You have hands-on experience working in the park, and really, Central Park couldn't do it as much as we know about the staff and all that. The level of volunteerism, and people get really dedicated to certain. They have zone gardeners. It's one of the first parks to look at the park and zone out the park, so the same people work in the same area all year round. So if there's issues and all that, people get to know who's there. It helps to, raise the maintenance of the park. And so there's a real team that's assigned to the Conservatory Gardens. So you really get to see the whole planting process, the pruning, the caring for it. And so a lot of people, some very prominent people who have gardens upstate and other places, come to just do it to get the experience and the knowledge. Let's see, anybody else? We'll take your, you want to go? Yeah, there's a lady back in the white. The microphone.
I don't know exactly how to ask you, but who keeps the budget? I wanted to know about the budget to keep the park the way it is.
Well, I actually should have mentioned this earlier. For the garden in 1987, a family created or donated an endowment for the garden's maintenance. So that's how this garden is maintained, through this endowment. The budget for the entire park is, the Conservancy is a nonprofit group that has a partnership with the city, and the Conservancy raises 85% of the park's operating costs from private funding, and then gets about 15% from the city. So primarily the park is privately funded. And then construction projects and restoration projects are also, usually that involves fundraising and also getting money from the city, but primarily fundraising. And so that money comes from primarily private sources as well.
I was talking to some friends the other week, and we were talking about, Central Park and the turning around of the public's perception of New York. And I think it was really true for New Yorkers. But I started thinking about out-of-towners. I started thinking Rockefeller Center and NBC going out on that plaza at 7 o'clock in the morning. Because now there's tourists get up at 5 o'clock to see Katie Couric or whoever was there at 7. And I think subliminally it started to let people around the country realize the streets can't be so bad if they're out there. And now everybody does it. I mean, every TV show has a window on the street and this sense of access, and the streets are safe. But when I first came here in 1980, that wasn't really the case. So I think that, in part, with the sense that those streets lead to places like Central Park and these wonderful parks. But most of the time, parks were isolated from public traffic. And when the city was really down, as wonderful as they were, to try to keep them up and monitor activity was really, really hard. And until an organization like the Conservancy really came along, there just wasn't the manpower and the policing power and stuff to really make that happen. And now the policing power is really the presence of the public and the people that work in the park. We have a mic, 1 second. They're trying to record this, so we need the mic. She's coming.
Earlier you mentioned your research on playgrounds.
Mm-hmm.
So can you talk a little bit about what's happening now with the children's playground that's being renovated?
Sure. I actually was inside it today. That is a playground that we're rebuilding as part of an initiative to enhance and rebuild all of the park's 21 playgrounds. So these are playgrounds that were built during the Robert Moses administration and have undergone numerous transformations already, but some of them haven't been redone for 20 or 25 years. Some of them were redone somewhat recently, but maybe need a few things to be fixed. But it's this idea that we want to look at the playgrounds as a system and as a whole, as opposed to look at them as individual projects. And so we put together planning document that outlined our plans for the playgrounds. And this is actually the first playground to be rebuilt as part of this plan. And one of the things we want to do in this playground and with all our playgrounds is kind of better integrate them with the larger park. So instead of, again, this idea that a lot of these Moses era constructions had these fences, these really tall fences around them. And so breaking down the idea that there's this barrier between the playground and the park. And so lowering the fences or even doing away with fences altogether and having a sort of low fence that snakes through the landscape that's kind of hidden. But again, thinking about how to make the playgrounds less these kind of urban spaces and more spaces that make you feel like you're playing in Central Park.
Well, here's where Harlem again's been an innovator because
Yeah.
what's the name of the playground that's near Frederick Douglass Boulevard? And
I think it's just called the West 110th
right,
Street
but it was one of the
Playground.
first.
Yeah.
I encourage you to go down there because it's one of the first where they did break down that barrier between the sense of like the fencing and the green space around it. So when you're there, you feel nestled in the greenery and you feel a kid can kind of reach to the fence or touch the greenery and all that. And yet it still has this division from public use, but it's not at all as visible as before. So now we're going to see the first one in that whole system of really looking at that in the next site. So thank you.
Yeah, it should be open in August, I'm hoping.
Since you mentioned this, is any part of the new design inspired by Noguchi's playgrounds that some of them were never built?
Not exactly, but we are using a lot of stone, but it's not very Noguchi-esque stone. I think one of the things we're also trying to do is move away from or try to think of alternatives to using just standardized equipment all the time, which is something we've been successful at in other playgrounds. But there's a lot of custom equipment here that we designed, and in some other playgrounds too, we've been sort of doing things like undulating the ground plane and making these mounds, and so that it's not just an experience of equipment, but it's experience of topography and texture and these other things that are important for kids to have a sort of diversity of experiences. But I think it's interesting to talk about playgrounds in relation to the garden, again, as this sort of discrete facility. I think the garden is so much more successful than a lot of the playgrounds were in terms of feeling integrated with the park. The playgrounds were, again, spaces that felt very urban, whereas this, even though it is this, it does have a fence around it and one gate, and, it was built as this kind of specialized facility, it feels much more integrated with the purpose of the park as well.
And think about playgrounds in the early playgrounds, the monkey bars. Any of us old enough to remember monkey bars, and it's just very, very simple, basic kinds of metal climbing equipment. And so it's so evolved over time that old infrastructure and framework really doesn't really speak to like the
Right.
options that are available. Question? Yeah. Oh, who's it?
What do you think is distracting the people to go to the park? Maybe is it the zoo or the theater, or is it that it's very secret?
Well, I think it's an exploratory. I mean, it was interesting the person talking about the broad lawn, because I think that's the teaser, and maybe for some people they think it's either limited and they don't go in. So it is trying to figure out ways to entice people to get in there a little more. But they've had music, they've had some sort of events in that space to sort of encourage more public activity. But it is kind of like a reward, and for people who live in the neighborhood, they really do know it. So I talked to people in East Harlem growing up and all of that, and they really feel that was a little like, part of their growing up is discovering that it was more than that lawn and these other parts of the park. So, and you want the park to have some aspect of that of discovery, and it's like you're a special place, and you kind of bring people to it. So one of the things she was saying, maybe if it was more broadly seen, it wouldn't have that peaceful quality that makes it nice to go have lunch and sort of really explore the plant material with not 1,000 people breathing down your neck while she's trying to read the labels. Who was the plant labels? You had a question, right?
I wondered with curiosity about what people think now of the role that John Lindsay and Thomas Hoving played in all of this.
Well, I was going to include this, but during that period, there was actually this big installation of sculptures on the lawn, speaking of ways to use the lawn. And they were kind of really involved in trying to, the park at this point was in a really bad shape, and so they were trying to kind of draw people into the park, and one way to do that was to do these kind of art projects and happenings. And so that it did, I didn't realize until I started doing this project, but it did extend to up here, and they had this big sculpture installation on this lawn. And again, that was probably a way to try to get people to come up to this space and garden that hadn't been coming up there.
When was the traffic?
Oh, the traffic on the drives, or what do you?
It seemed to me that there were days when the park was closed off.
Yeah, that started in the 1960s. In 1966, they closed the drives to traffic on weekends and made it open to pedestrians and bikers, and that's the first time in the park's history that happened. And then it's continued being diminished over time.
And I think that's been the balancing act with Central Park. It's such a public place and people really love it, but they've kept the inventory. If they did all the things people wanted, there would be no Central Park, from landing strips to this and that. So there's always these phases. And I think the great thing about the maintenance plan and all that was to look at this broader design and history of the park, and certain things became kind of sacred in terms of elements within that bigger design. And it will accommodate, like the playgrounds. Playgrounds changed in thinking over time. They were never part of the original design for the park, but something the public wanted. So how do you deal with that and kind of do what people would like to see for recreation, but also be appreciative of this broader history? So this new thinking is about doing a little bit of both things, accommodating that sense of adventure and play, but also still feeling like part of the park. So you have to be kind of measured over time. All right. Okay, we'll take one more and then we'll...
Thank you. First, a tip. As far as I know, you can go to the compost pile on the mound, and if you live in Manhattan, you can take some home with you. It's available for residents to use for their personal use.
I know they do mulching, and your Christmas tree. They come in. You can kind of have your all grind it up and use it for mulch.
Yeah. The other question, something that I've never really thought about, but came up today in my mind, looking at these gardens that represent Italian, English, and French, very European styles, and the park draws people from the city draws people from all over the world, and I was just curious if you know about the evolution of Central Park. Obviously, parts of it need to stay the same, otherwise, as you said, it won't be Central Park. But in terms of incorporating as a place where people come to enjoy nature in different ways, incorporating the styles of other cultures. For example, having a Japanese garden or a Middle Eastern garden, maybe, or different garden styles.
That is the challenge. Well, one thing, it's a landmark, so it's been made a historic landscape.
That's the first scenic landmark. First landscape in the city to be landmarked.
So everything they do has to go through this whole review process about making changes, for one. And then you have to think back, this was so phenomenal. Most parks in Europe, the European parks, were built for kings that have evolved to public use. This was a park built for the people. It was built on a kingly scale for the people. And then he was so innovative, the drives that cut through the park. And when the first designs, a lot of the other designers, they divided up the park into 4 or 5 sections so those streets could go through. Well, he figured out a way to bridge over it. So when you're in the park, you have no sense that this traffic is moving under you. Well, Disneyland copied that format. Well, and with this whole other level, so there was innovation and things in those kinds of designs that shouldn't be second fiddle to just every whim and change. And so I think even though people see this broader possibility, there's also a respect to sort of say, well, this is something uniquely American that came along that reflected democracy in the landscape and all of that. And so it's not so quick. If you want to see a really great Oriental garden, maybe go to Japan. It would be like going to Japan and telling Japan to put Central Park in a sacred Japanese garden. in terms of the scale
Yeah.
of what the park is, you know,
Yeah.
and because you go other places, there are Japanese gardens in other parks, the Snug
It's
Harbor.
true.
And
It just
other
feels
places.
like Central Park was made by Europeans for, with European aesthetics in mind. Well, what I mean, the people.
And think back.
I'm. It's. I mean, I'm not arguing against the beauty of Central Park. I love it, but it does represent the sort of European aesthetic.
Well, no, it's a very,
It was inspired by the English countryside,
well, I won't go through the whole thing, but
Yeah.
I find it interesting as an architect looking at it. I felt Olmsted was between painting and the movies with Central Park, because he looked at English landscape painting, he did, and the public were going to cemeteries that these people had designed because there weren't parks, and they realized that they wanted to incorporate a public park. But the fact that none of those roads in those cemeteries were straight is because they wanted to direct you to various views. If you go to the Woodlawn, you can look out and see the Hudson River and all these different things. And he was doing the same thing, but his path was like the sprockets in film to me. He knew where you were going. You didn't. Like a great director, he was leading you and through this dark, shadowy place to see the body of water, to see the hillside and all that. And I think that's a really unique. It's like taking a movie and starting to cut it apart and say, well, I like Hitchcock, but Hitchcock is a very English movie director, and so I want to put in, Rashomon or some other piece into it. Part of the integrity, if you really give yourself over to it, there's a whole education and looking at this, this culture that was taking in how immigrants would live in New York, how they would be. Start to look at the middle class and how they would conduct their lives, and all that. The dairy was there to give milk to children. I mean, there's a fascinating history. Before I throw that out, I would want to understand it in its completeness, because I think there's some fascination in that's very, very American, very New York. Not even very American, it's very uniquely New York that became American in broader ways, but very much about the city growing and thinking about all kinds of people coming using the park and all that. I don't think it was exclusionary at all. I think in many ways it was much more.
Oh yeah, I guess I'm being taken the wrong way. I don't think Central Park should change significantly, and I don't think it's exclusionary at all. I just feel like I think it would be nice to have it somewhat evolve to a little bit, parts of it, a tiny part of it, just like the playgrounds are evolving a little bit, to have some of the gardens evolve to represent some other kind of styles from around the world. But that's okay if it's too controversial.
It's not controversial. I mean, Yoko, when John Lennon died, she asked for people to give things to Central Park as a memorial for John Lennon. 71 countries sent things. That piece of Imagine is a fraction of what the Italians were giving to cover the area. And it realized they just couldn't do it. So if you go to Imagine, look at that plaque as you go up the hill and look at all the countries that were listed. That would have been 68 things. And yet she was the first donor to give $1 million to Central Park and restore that whole area. And that one medallion to me of Imagine, it says so much more than if she had accepted the collection of a potpourri of things from all over the country. And so that's what we're kind of talking about. There are impulses that come that maybe the public, that represents a time in the public's thinking, that in the end become a repository. Some of it does fall and land in Central Park, but it can't be everything. It is, the gentleman made an interesting point, it is episodic throughout the whole experience. It's not about separate little, like going to a museum and looking at this gallery and that gallery, that gallery. It really is about this continuity of space. And those things you're talking about, over time, just like John Lennon, and he lived near Central, there was a meaningful connection to where he lived and what happened to him that the public felt moved enough that this is something they wanted to include in Central Park. And over time, those elements come into the park. But there's a lot of vetting and emotion for that to happen. It would be if it was huge. I was here in 1980. I'm saying, but I was here in the time when that came, and some people wanted it, some people didn't. Some people didn't want it that scale. It went through a whole vetting process that allowed that one piece to be there. But I think in the end, it was great that there was a vetting process in that, because that became something very meaningful that still touches people's hearts over time. I'm just saying these things could happen, but it has to be a real. I think it's precious to people. So, okay, thank you. Thank you. Now we have Do we have a piece of paper for people who want to take the tour? If someone wants to start a sheet of paper for us, okay. Yeah, we'll put it up here. If you just would clearly write your email, your name and your email, we'll send you the